Right, so with the measurement of time scientifically, what is time ultimately? The definition of time in a lot of places, the continued sequence of existence and events that occurs in an apparently irreversible succession from the past through the present into the future. Now, physicists and other scientists have been in pursuit of defining time according to natural law-based principles generally. And Einstein and his theories of relativity have provided a lot of the base of what we understand and where a lot of these theories have sprung from. So his theory gave us a view that time is in fact the fourth dimension, and that humans can measure this fourth dimension with clocks. There's also often a distinctive linearity to time in which, although we experience it as a passage, neither past nor future have any real relevance in our present existence in some ways. So the concepts of past and future remain embedded generally within the minds of humans because we're the only ones that can fathom that. So an example of this is while we can make decisions that affect our future, we cannot necessarily make decisions that affect our past as time passes and we experience that passing only in the now, because now is all that really exists, or is it? So how we understand time, or at least one of the most accepted concepts of time, comes from a man named Ludwig Boltzmann, who defined time in direct relation to entropy. So in this way, time is condensed down to little more than just the passage of decay. And because of the very human ability to identify change, we can identify movement through time by experiencing certain aspects of existence ultimately fall into chaos. So for those that don't know, just a quick brief overview, entropy is a measure of how disorderly things are. So basically, when something begins afresh, it has low entropy or more order. And as time passes around it, or at least sometimes through it, entropy increases and it falls into chaos. So everyone knows that there's that one person who seems to just be in a constant state of a rapid increase in entropy. So their rooms will just turn into absolute chaos before it's reorganized and the process then starts all over again. Now, there are some fascinating theories of which time is being explored by physicists, and a lot of them stick to the mathematical measurements, so what we've derived from Einstein and his theories and a few others. But there are some, like, for example, just Wheeler-de Wit equation, which in fact describe the universe without any reference to time at all. Now, these kind of then bar the question, or at least offer up the question, could it not then stand to reason that time is not really time at all, that it doesn't necessarily exist at all? So at least to humans, it is little more than the observation of decay of the physical existence of entities in entropy. So physics gives us the most accurate measures of time. With atomic clocks, it is possible to have the most precise readings of seconds in the world. This graphic on the screen at the moment is in fact a short clip from the University of Colorado in Boulder, that has now made the world's most precise clock. Anyway, so physics gives us this most accurate measure of time. But even with these extremely accurate measures of time, what does this really mean to a human? So having an extremely accurate clock could perhaps just merely serve to give us less of an excuse to be a minute or two late for a meeting, or to not arrive at the birthday party on time, or, to perhaps just keep a more accurate record of past events. And is this why time really matters? So is it that that time means something to humans because we in fact experience it in the form of identifying change within our mind's eye? Now, the movement forward through the passage of time in which humans watch entropy in motion is just moving in place in an endless tunnel as time passes by, collecting memories of past events, imagining future ones, and yet only ever experiencing current events. So that is how our science tells us that time exists. So that the present is a clear picture and the past is a fuzzy one and the future is this imaginary one, that seems to be more of a human construct or understanding. So while physics can give us some level of understanding the real dynamics of change, of time, it doesn't really change our perception, because the passage of human existence is ultimately subjective. Now, this subjective relationship with time allows some humans to experience sometimes the past more vividly than they would their present, and envision a future that manifests itself due to active decisions made on the part of the human. So you can, in a few ways or in a lot of ways, ultimately control your future. So is it then that time is just an illusion in which a human hallucinates a series of passing events because from entropy, things change, and change provides us with a picture of passing time? Now, the block universe, which comes from Einstein's theory of the four-dimensional reality, as I mentioned earlier, places the present in an ultimately static place, as though the present is a ball that's rolling down an eternal hill. And it's because the present is neither gone nor coming. So in this universe, the human perception of time is purely illusionary, because physics states that past, present, and future, namely that hill, are all happening simultaneously. Now, for a human, this concept is virtually unfathomable. So humans perceive time as that passage through existence. So as I mentioned before, from one event into another, consuming and collecting. And at the moment of consumption of that event is when that event is the most real. It then becomes attached and continues to exist in this fuzzy format. Now, we're kind of like that old Nokia game, for those that remember Snake, where every pixel of the snake gets attached to the snake's tail until ultimately it's too long not to bump into itself and die. It's a bit of a morbid comparison, but in this sense, the only way we really know that time has passed is ultimately because the snake has grown. So when it comes to the psychology of time, it's probably more accurate to describe it as exploring the various mental processes that humans become aware of time. So in the sense, it's not necessarily that humans perceive time, but rather that they perceive the changes that happen over time. And a good example of this is experiencing the changes within our bodies as we age. So we don't necessarily experience aging, we experience the effects of aging. And to relate it to the scientific element of it, just to watch our bodies fall into entropy. Now, with regards to perceived temporal experience, the psychologist and neuroscientist Ernst Poppel has outlined a number of what he calls elementary time experiences in a human's perception of time. So they range from duration and non-simultaneity, order, past, present, and of course, change, which includes that passage of time. So I won't be going into the fundamentals of each. It's definitely not enough time, although I'd love to, but rather just to note that the temporal experience of time is often inextricably linked to tense, so past, present, future. However, the question of the order in which those experiences are had is often called into question. So consider for a moment whether you've ever had the chance to experience or re-experience, if you will, something that you've forgotten about, like when somebody or something has reminded you of an event that you were no longer thinking of. So it could be said that you in fact experienced this past event in your present, ultimately living it for the first time rather than reliving it after the time you've forgotten it. Just wrap your heads around that one. I love that. So the one remaining constant with all experience of time is that it will only ever happen in the now, because the present is the only true reality, right? So let's consider for a moment the concept of which comes from this temporal experience. It's called the specious present. So it's a psychological theory that was characterized by a man named William James in 1890 under his principles of psychology. And it refers to the mental measurement of the present, of now. So the specious present can actually last anywhere between a non-zero and a short term. So depending on the circumstances in which that human is experiencing this present. So this theory was focused on establishing ultimately the length of now. So perception of motion is often used to illustrate this concept, like this GIF on the screen that you guys can see. Humans perceive motion instead of static moments. So it's the same as movies or GIFs or anything else. It's actually just a series of still images that are played in succession, which are then seen as movement. Now, it is this motion that allows humans to experience this passage of time, to experience this change as something that's fluid rather than just to event. And these are often, at least the conception of emotion is based on the difference between the placement of something that was and then something that is. Again, to reference that aging thing, your hands were less wrinkly at some point and then they become more. And you only really know that they're more because you remember a time when they weren't. But of course, as the concept of the specious present states, this passing of time can sort of vary in length when it comes to the present. So the variance in length is ultimately the distance between the content of consciousness and the act of consciousness. So the more aware you are of time passing, the slower that present time space will be, which is why what often happens when we are in a queue or eager to get going, time seems to slow down. And it's because the act of consciousness is very much placed on that time. And the content of the consciousness is not, what is the word, visceral enough for us to be paying more attention to that content.
So, Jess?
Yes?
Can I check with you? So I think that, I mean, that's the thing in computational social science, is that if you had to think of asking humans, you know, when you run into somebody, ask him when last did they put in fuel in their vehicle and what was the time that it took them to do it, and then please tell me the last 5 times that you've done it and give me the exact date and time, and then trying to figure out, you know, if they've been to, say, a restaurant on their way, you know, or whatever the actions were that they performed in that time frame. And it's almost like history just becomes this blur that confuses the things that you do right now. So the more you are in a moment and the more you don't remember. So that's why it's very different than if you have a data point telling you what people are doing than if they just had to be asked what they're thinking about that moment.
Yeah, definitely. And it's very much like that example that I posed just now with the snake. We collect these events, and the more times that we do something, like, for example, putting fuel in, the less likely you are to separate the memory of what those events are. Unless, of course, there's something that is particularly striking that's helped you to remember that present that then becomes something that you focus on in past. So yes, if you do get stuck in that present moment, it can last, any distance of time. But so there's also something called perceived temporal length, which is about the ways in which time can vary based on your, emotional relationship with this present event. So like I mentioned just now, where an hour can feel like 3 because you're waiting. And so the contents of your consciousness are experiencing the present and ultimately getting lost within that present, not necessarily grasping something to hold on to, or something that could be, like Jay said, the data point in this sense would be a lot more accurate. Now, there's another example of temporal experience, which I'm keen to just touch on here because I think that it's something that a lot of people have experienced. And it's kind of cool to think about it. And that the present never actually exists, or at least the present that we understand never exists. Because when an event happens, the time that it takes for us to see and absorb that event, to process it and to understand it, we are then understanding something that has happened in the past. Again, not necessarily relevant here, but I'm digressing a little bit, but it's something that I find is really quite fascinating. Okay, so back to temporal length. It stands to reason, according to this concept, that in order to increase like participation, the event must bear some sort of enjoyment or significance to the human, lest they get bored and wander off.